Hi, my name's Tony Lambert. I'm a senior malware analyst here at Red Canary on the intelligence team, and I'm going to be moderating today for this webinar series, um, the detection series for initial access. We're going to be talking about the ways that bad guys break into systems and ways that we can, fight back against that. Couple of housekeeping items to take care of before we get started. The two evergreen questions that always come up from this. Yes, this is being recorded. Yes, this is going to be in your email afterwards. Yes, you can go take a look at it afterwards, and you don't have to do screenshots right now if you don't want to, but hey, there's nobody here to stop you. So if you want to just sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride, you can do so, and know that all of that is coming in your email later. Before we get started, I want to do kind of a quick note of gratitude as well. I know that, there's a lot of stuff going on, that's a busy world, and you could choose to do a lot of things with your time. Thanks for spending it here with us because, these webinars aren't possible without a community, and we can't do it without folks like you. So all that said, let's jump in and do introductions. So I'm Tony. Miss Selena, would you like to go next?
Yes, hello. I love getting started with a moment of gratitude. I'm going to steal that from you, Tony. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Selena Larson. I am a threat researcher here at Proofpoint, where I focus mostly on cybercrime and cyber criminal activities, everything ranging from initial access brokers like in ransomware all the way to fraud and BEC. So very excited to be here and looking forward to having a great conversation.
Hey, I'm Adam Pennington. I'm with the MITRE Corporation, where I lead the MITRE attack framework. Fun fact, I originally led the creation of the initial access tactics. It's kind of a cool webinar to get to be a part of today.
Awesome. Hi, I'm Stef. I am an Intel analyst here at Red Canary. I've been here for a little over 3 years. For that, I did a couple of years in DFIR at Mandiant, and I'm super excited. I love talking about initial access and initial execution. It's one of my favorite topics.
Awesome stuff. Thanks everybody for introductions, and talk a little bit about the agenda that we have going on today. So it's going to be quite a bit of content because there's a lot of stuff that adversaries use nowadays to try to gain initial footholds into organizations. So right off, so we can understand the problem, we're going to define the problem. We're going to define what initial access is. We're going to talk about the most prevalent techniques that we've observed being used in the wild across organizations, across industries, things like that. We're going to talk about a few strategies that organizations can use to fight back against this. You're not just alone and helpless in this. You can push back against this, against adversaries. And we'll talk about some additional resources at the end, simply because we like knowing that we can help people branch out into other content and be able to get into other resources here. So we'll do a little bit of that at the end, along with questions. If you have any questions, absolutely feel free to toss those into the Q&A section in the Zoom controls, and we will address that as we go. All right, so kicking it off with the initial definition of initial access, Mr. Adam, would you take us away?
Yeah, so straight out of attack itself, we say initial access consists of techniques that use various entry vectors to gain their initial foothold within a network. So we have a to-do to improve the language for that for version 18, but what do we really mean by that? So initial access is, next slide, initial access is where an adversary first takes offensive action against the target. It's where, if you like the terminology, it's where they move from left to right of boom. It's that spear phishing, drive-by download, supply chain compromise. It's the action to get into a network or get into a victim space. And so it is a critical pivot for an adversary. And unlike some tactics, if you prevent initial access, you prevent every avenue an adversary has for it, there is no intrusion. And so because of that, it's often a space heavily focused on by defenders, border security, looking at email, looking at web traffic, looking at the ways that adversaries are getting in. So fun fact, attack used to not have initial access. So right of boom was covered by the attack framework, left was covered by since deprecated framework called pre-attack. We wanted to move attack a little bit to the left. And so we borrowed material from pre-attack's launching compromise tactic to form the initial access tactic. So the techniques in attack, the basic high-level techniques, haven't changed a lot since its creation. Adversaries have been using the same basic techniques for a really long time. Although we did just add a new technique to initial access in version 17, just back in April, of Wi-Fi networks. And so this is to cover the activity that was talked about last year by Velexity and others, where adversaries were going from access points near to a victim and getting into the victim's network that way. Next slide.
I love that note of like, it's novel, but not common.
Yep. Yeah. And so having said that, with the techniques are, have been around for a while and things are getting used over long periods of time, took a look back at threat reporting over the last 20 years. And, we did see some general trends that seemed to line up with, I think, what a lot of us seen over time. So if you go back to the Stone Age, we saw adversaries doing a lot of mass email spear phishing, emailing a certain percentage of a company, just hoping that they could get in the door, looking around for whatever they were looking for, if they found some success with that. We even saw some stuff with USB sticks back when auto run off a USB stick was a bit easier than it was today. And over time, we saw a trend towards targeting. This came in a couple ways: more targeted spear phishing. We're going after victims that had access to particular data, but also watering hole attacks, infecting websites and spaces where particular communities accessed to try to get to a class of victims or a specific victim that way. Now, defenders got better at protecting their borders. They got better at their email and web traffic. And so we saw a move to more credential harvesting, looking for legitimate accounts and coming in through external remote services, just logging into the border. And so then when we had the uptick of ransomware, obviously everybody's been dealing with this for a while now, but we saw some new trends coming out of that. Rediscovery of even more spear phishing, lots of Office macros, all sorts of different types of attachments. We saw some splitting of responsibilities, more use of initial access brokers, where one group would get in and one group would take advantage of it, both in the ransomware and even the APT space, where some state actors seem to be breaking up their activity between groups. We had some big headlines from supply chain compromise. Everybody remembers SolarWinds, but they weren't the only one. There were a number of various open source projects and other spaces where adversaries were getting into the software supply chain and getting to victims that way. And again, evading the boundary in a different way. And more recently, we've been talking a lot about malvertising. So malicious ads getting into JavaScript, going back into the browser. And so we're back to drive-by downloads again with a different name and a different technique, as well as we've seen a lot more with exploiting public-facing applications. And again, this is a return to even before the Stone Age, where adversaries are just breaking in from the outside, this time going after appliances we've forgotten about, maybe that application that's been on our network hasn't been patched for 20 years that just happens to still be there. And so that brings us to today's webinar, where we're going to talk about some of the activities that we've been seeing a little bit more recently.
And I love going over the timeline. Like, it really paints the picture of how, even though some of the how some of the defined details change over the years, the larger tradecraft is still valid. Like the larger, what comes to mind is, phishing attachments, things like those. Like, even though we're kind of living in that post Microsoft Office macro world, they're still phishing. They just use different attachments this time around. Public facing application exploitation, one week it's going to be Microsoft Exchange or SharePoint, and then the next week it happens to be an F5 appliance or different things like that. So I love kind of showing how, like, where if people just focus on these generic techniques a little bit and not necessarily get hung up in the day-to-day details as much, they can still be ready, still be prepared.
Yeah, none of these have stopped. I mean, it's not like adversaries ever stop spear phishing. It's always a thing. email protection vendors are going to have a job for quite a ways to come.
Mhm.
But we do see ebbs and flows.
Awesome. Well, all that said, let's talk about a little bit of our initial access that we observe in the wild nowadays. There are quite a few things that adversaries have been using frequently in the last few months. And probably one of the more annoying ones that we have all had to deal with as defenders across the spectrum has been some of the ClickFix stuff. So, Miss Selena, I think you have some stuff to talk about with this.
Yes, thank you so much. Also, Adam, I'm just waiting for exploit kicks to make a comeback. Everything old is new again as we are going on the life cycle of malware, initial access, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really interesting to see that although there are trends, obviously, where threat actors prefer one initial access method to another, what we do see is a lot of these are still regularly used and innovated on. So ClickFix, of course, is one of these that has just really exploded from initial access threat actors using this technique, whether it is via URLs delivered via email or if it is using those web injects on compromised websites. And what I find so interesting about this technique is it's a social engineering technique. So it's not necessarily a very interesting technical feature of an overall attack chain, but essentially what it is these dialog boxes that contain these fake error messages, and they effectively trick people into copying, pasting, and running malicious commands in PowerShell. So most of what we see here are criminally motivated, financially motivated threat actors are doing these types of attacks, but we do also see espionage using this technique as well. So you see this really interesting technique kind of propagating across the landscape. And what this is someone is actually infecting themselves, right? So it's not, clicking to enable macros anymore. It's how do we convince them to, click and run PowerShell? So I wanted to share this diagram from what we see in our email threat campaign. So we first observed ClickFix, this technique, back in March of last year by a couple of our more prominent and a little bit more sophisticated, that's such a weasel word, but some of the more fun, I guess, adversaries to track from the cyber criminal threat landscape. And it really kind of has become so prevalent across the board. So it's not just these more clever cyber criminal adversaries, it's a lot of people really adopting this technique. And to me, this shows that the technique works. Because threat actors wouldn't keep using it, it wouldn't keep growing, we wouldn't have multiple different threat clusters delivering various payloads if it wasn't. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of talk about some of the APT activity that we're seeing as well. So from the e-crime perspective, we're seeing a lot of different payloads being delivered. Certainly information stealers are a big favorite for ClickFix threat actors in the e-crime threat landscape, which we'll talk about later on in this presentation today. But it is also state-sponsored adversaries are using it too. So we've actually seen in just 90 days between 2024 through early 2025, we saw DPRK threat actors, Iranian and Russia threat actors, all using this ClickFix technique is as part of their routine activity. And so when we think about kind of the idea and changes from the initial access perspective, one thing that will never change, we've seen, all of these changes go along, but one thing that will never change is the innovation and threat actors trying new things. And oftentimes they're very effective and they work and they will get broadly adopted by the threat landscape overall. So next slide, Tony.
And I love mentioning kind of the everything kind of waiting for that exploit kit stuff to come back, because I've kind of been looking at this as the new exploit kit sort of thing, because all of this is essentially productized and commoditized on the adversary side, where there are templates they can use. Like there's all
Yeah.
sorts of like JavaScript stuff where they can just spin these sites out really quick, like they could with the exploit kits.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. It is kind of like the innovation of the sort of old OG, not quite, I guess, the Stone Age, what would be in
Yeah.
Bronze Age with exploit kits, but but yeah, so from our perspective, and I know you guys see a lot of ClickFix activity as well. So we see dozens of campaigns per month, and that number is literally just increasing. Like I mentioned, both via direct email as well as web injects. I also want to note that a lot of these campaigns use this fake CAPTCHA. So it's like this pretend, like verify that you're human check. This was actually something that was released on GitHub by a security researcher as a, hey, this is an interesting tool that could be used this way. And then, of course, threat actors started adopting it. A lot. Another fun example of initial access techniques that are posted on GitHub or other public malware repositories that are abused by threat actors. So it is really the most commonly observed ClickFix meme. What we see are JavaScript profiler that will lead to follow-on ransomware. Danabot, RIP, Luma Stealer, sort of RIP, Asyncrat, Xworm, Amity, Radamanthus, just a lot of information stealers as well. So I don't know, Tony or Steph, if you wanted to add anything from the malware delivery side or anything that you're seeing from the ClickFix side of the.
I think one of the things that's really jumped out to me is how effective it has been since it started. It hasn't really slowed down. It's just increased in volume. It's still super effective. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of different ways that these alerts are being delivered. There's a lot of different kinds of phishing tactics that are used, browser injects are used. So the alerts can end up in front of users in so many different ways. And it really sort of hinges on the very human tendency to click through verification as quickly as possible to get back to whatever it is that you were doing beforehand. And it's hard to get people to stop feeling that urgency. It's hard to get that human tendency to just sort of click through to ease up a little bit. And also the mitigations are really tricky, right? So for Windows, you could turn off Windows hotkeys, but then you're turning off Windows hotkeys with the GPO for your org. And that's not a very, it's a challenging thing to do and to like get it, it would be a challenging thing to
Getting
kind of,
that buy-in.
yeah, get buy-in with folks for, because it's used so much. So yeah, it's really interesting how this is taken off and it's just continues to keep rolling and expand in scope.
Yeah, and I think a through line for when we're talking about initial access, you mentioned it is very human. It is a very human response. They're wanting someone to make a decision. It's this idea of, oh, you can fix this yourself. Click here to, copy and run. But that is also a through line, I think, for a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about, is it targets individuals and people. And it relies on an individual person making a decision, being convinced of something, whether that's, and someone impersonating IT, whether that's someone thinking that they can solve their software problem by clicking and running PowerShell. It's this very human targeted aspect, which I think is a little bit different, right? Like Adam mentioned earlier, and mass spamming, it was like a very reliable way of doing things, but now you need a little bit more of that human targeted factor for a lot of these campaigns. And I think, as we go through, you'll kind of see that trend, I think, in all of the things we're discussing today.
And I'm very glad that you mentioned like people imitating IT and targeting the human factor, because that kicks us off into something that I'm going to talk a little bit about here with ransomware incidents, where in this case, I'm picking on Black Basta because this was really seen heavily with Black Basta ransomware affiliates. But this is something that happened with other ransomware families as well. What we ended up seeing with Black Basta affiliates really strongly from the start of the year on a few months in, was that we would see adversaries try to create some sort of pretext so they could call someone and act as technical support. Again, going after that human perspective. But people have kind of grown to be suspicious of some things nowadays. Security awareness training is working despite some people's opinions. And so what adversaries have started doing is started trying to create those pretexts by any means possible. And one of the things that we ended up seeing with Black Basta affiliates is they started doing this email spam bombing stuff, where they would grab targeted users' email addresses. Let's say, they would use tlambert@abc.com. They would feed that email address into a spam bombing service. And then what you see on the screen here would be something what your email inbox would look like. You would have bunches of different messages in all sorts of different languages from a bunch of sites that you've never visited in your life. And the horrible part is that they would keep coming. And the really way to get around that is to like mark spam, delete, mark spam, all that stuff. But while you're doing all this, your user has been a softened up target for that adversary to try to call them and offer technical support. And that's what we ended up seeing with a lot of different organizations. And once some of that stuff started happening, we would end up seeing.
Okay, this is my slide, Remember,
sorry.
because we were talking about this ahead of time, and I'm like, I'm seeing these
Yeah.
themes that keep coming up for all of these. And Selena, you already mentioned that we've got some themes, but you're going to hear a lot of overlap. We're going to talk about social engineering for a lot of the trends that we've seen lately. We're going to talk about RMM tools more than once today. We're going to talk about folks and groups that are using these techniques, and they're really effective when you combine all of these things, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we're talking about them today in this webinar.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love kind of seeing all of this stuff compiled together because like it's really kind of a perfect storm.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of scenario where all of it just kind of comes together to create just the right things. Um, I should have switched slides. Thank you. But yeah, talk about these social engineering part. What we ended up seeing, like give you a good example of this is in one organization that we talked to, adversary targeted a particular user and they imitated an IT person for that organization after doing the spam bombing thing. And they would call, say, hi, my name is such and such. I'm from the IT department. By the way, I'm based in such and such office. And they actually cited a real world location for the offices, but it was a little bit off because this individual user knew that IT person was like located remotely a little bit away from the office. And it turns out that that adversary had gotten these details from LinkedIn, had gotten details from stuff like social media, all of that good stuff. So finding out little inconsistencies like that were kind of interesting in working through some of this. They do that call, quick offer for assistance, and the RMM tools have been very widely varied. We've seen Microsoft Windows Quick Assist being included. We've seen AnyDesk. We have seen Screen Connect. We have seen just about any of them under the sun that you can think of. And it's quite fascinating to me because like if you look at the LOL RMM project, the one that compiles all these together, there are like 200 RMM tools to potentially focus on, which we'll talk a little bit about later. So like there's not really a good way to have a comprehensive thing to go against all of them. It's just kind of a piecemeal, we do better as a community as we go on with it. And then what we ended up seeing after that initial tech support call, that initial Screen Connect session, AnyDesk, Quick Assist, they would start dropping additional malware for persistence and be able to keep that persistent access. So if the individual user did kick them off of that Screen Connect session, they could still go back and be able to get into the system. So it was kind of fascinating to watch. And as we watched these adversaries evolve, they also started evolving to where uh, they changed up their playbook a little bit depending on the software that was on the system, depending on the EDR sensor. So that was really fascinating to go after. And kind of leaning some more into that social engineering stuff. Phishing is always a thing. It has been and always shall be. So I know Miss Selena looks at a lot of phishing.
Forever and ever. When we're all dead and humans are no longer here, there will still be emails, still be phishing. Also, side note, Tony, did the recipient ask the caller, what snacks do we serve in this specific office location? I feel like there's some security questions we could confirm.
They did not, but I actually do have a good story about that. Brief aside, proof that security awareness is working. This one particular user in the organization had got a call, but then the adversary moved on because that user got suspicious, and they asked the adversary to spell their name. And when the adversary got frustrated because they didn't want to spell the name, they didn't want to go through all this trouble, they just said, you know what, there's greener grass somewhere else. They hung up and decided to call someone else.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, frustrating the caller.
Absolutely. And
Good
anybody
thing.
who has ever worked in IT has probably had those calls before and has been on that side before. So I know it's frustrating for you as an IT support technician, but every little bit helps.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I mean, quickly just wanted to cover this: email smishing, callback phishing, aka telephone oriented attack delivery, which we call TOADs. And I'm so upset to whoever added pushing to the slide, QR code phishing. Oh, I can't believe I said that word. But it's all there, right? This is very prominent initial access. We're still seeing a ton of it. And all of these things can lead to the attack chains that we're talking about, right? So it doesn't matter, how it gets there, the attack chains and the techniques that we're using, certainly RMM, for sure, it will get there, especially with like toad attacks, for example, right? You call a pretend support system and they tell you to install an RMM to get help. Unfortunately, I know multiple people who have fallen for those, and have done some good education for some older folks in my life to prevent that in the future. So you want to go to the next slide, Tony? Yeah, so if we're talking about RMMs, and I kind of tiled aside the new loaders because as people who have listened to me for a long time know that I love talking about how the initial access landscape has shifted dramatically, including like loaders are going bye-bye in large part to law enforcement disruption, shout out Operation Endgame. But what we're seeing is a lot more threat actors using legitimate RMM tools in actual email campaigns as a first stage loader. So I know before we were talking about this webinar, Stef and Tony, we chatted about how RMM tools, what you were seeing in the post exploitation phase, so to move across within network, is a little bit different than the initial access RMMs that are being and so that shift, right? So we've seen RMMs in ransomware campaigns forever. They'll get on there with a loader and then drop some other like AnyDesk or another RMM tool that you guys are seeing. But now we're seeing it as a first stage payload. So it's the legitimate software usually used by IT admins, which can also lead to detection issues. I don't know if you guys want to highlight some of the things that you've learned from your incidents or tips that you have for defenders from if you're actually using this legitimately, but it gets dropped maliciously. It's changed a lot, I think, the actual RMM delivery.
Yeah, I'll share one from what we've learned is that most often it seems like the legitimate ones will be installed under program files, things like that, but adversaries often just install them anywhere they can and anywhere that they will have room on disk. So like it'll be under a user folder or it may be renamed or something like that. But program files ones tend to be the ones in my experience tend to be the more IT ones. But it's also been kind of fun hearing from different organizations that their vendors all require different RMMs because they have to have X, Y, or Z RMM to be able to get access.
Yeah, so that's where it gets tricky too, right? Like, okay, maybe your organization is just one particular one, but then you work with one of your suppliers that requires a different one. And then soon you're having 5 different RMM tools on your host. And yeah, hence why I think that list is up to 270 something. It's so long now, the little RMM list. But if you want to go to the next slide, Tony, we can kind of see that this is from a blog that we published earlier this year, but the first stage RMM tooling is increasing. And the initial access broker malware, these loaders that we typically see with initial access brokers leading to ransomware, whether it's IceID, Darkgate, DanaBot, RIP, Smoke Loader, QBot, these are decreasing. So you're seeing this innovation and threat actors trying to pivot to new payloads in order to facilitate initial access. And then they might even drop a follow-on RMM. So it could be just like RMM dropping yet another RMM or RMM dropping a rat. So you see as this is increasing, the loaders are decreasing. And that kind of aligns to, I think, with the increase in info stealers, which we'll also talk about. But we go to the next slide, Tony. Yeah, so it's not to say that all ransomware actors have pivoted to RMMs, and it's just to say that the landscape is really shifting, and there are new and different tools that will follow the disruption of major botnets and loaders, and we see that all the time, whether it's a malware just going out of business, saying I don't want to do this anymore, or whether, and usually because of law enforcement activity, they say, okay, I'm hanging up this particular malware hat. It just causes behavioral shifts in the landscape. And this is one of those, pivoting to legitimate RMMs. And we see it on dark web's marketplaces too, like selling access. So you're seeing a lot of this increase as well. And the campaign volumes have increased. But what's interesting to note is although the message volumes are down, we're seeing more campaigns delivering RMMs as an initial access type of malware, but the amount of messages that we see is much, much, much lower. So I'm curious, from the initial access perspective, we see a lot of, Screen Connect mostly is a big one, but from the actual like post exploitation on network, we see TeamViewer, Atera, and Net Support as kind of the main ones. Does that align with what Red Canary is seeing in terms of post exploitation RMM deployment?
I think that's on our next slide.
Perfect.
It is.
Yeah. So we have seen a different set of RMMs in different post-exploitation activity. Although, as you were talking, I just remembered we have seen a ClickFix paste and run campaign that was just delivering net support. That was the primary follow-on payload. So net support was our number 7 threat for the year last year across all of our customers. So not just for RMMs, but also just sheer volume. Yes, we're seeing much more than we were in previous years. We also see we see Type B and C, ConnectWise, TeamViewer, and Advanced Run as kind of the more frequently seen, but there are more that we just don't see quite as commonly or that don't get to that post-exploitation execution or delivery phase. And I think there's a lot of reasons why net support in particular is one that we tend to see. I think the fact that you can get a free trial makes it a very popular choice. And also it is so commonly used in organizations legitimately. So it's a difficult one to say, we're not going to have this, as you were saying, in our environments. There can be SLAs that make people have to keep the different RMMs available. And yeah, it's been leveraged by a lot of different groups that we have seen. So we've seen these RMMs, as you mentioned, ransomware groups like Black Basta affiliated groups, delivered by social engineering tactics. So yeah, it's just, we also are seeing that increased use. I think everyone is.
And for frequency, I know something that always kind of hits me is the frequency of it. Like we're talking multiple times a week, every week. When we look across many organizations, across many industries, it's not necessarily one industry. One organization may see this multiple times a day, multiple times a week, but across our data set, we see this multiple times a week.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome.
And this has been going for quite a while too. I mean, I was just looking back on when the Red Canary detection series we did that I took part in on remote access software was all the way back in 2023, where we were already talking about it having gone on consistently for a while. And so if people want to hear another hour about just remote access tools or RMM specifically too, I think it's already out there.
Before we move on from RMMs, we have a bunch of RMM questions in the chat. So one of them that I wanted to see if we could give any sort of shooting from the hip answers, what recommendations would we have to prevent the use or mitigate the use of RMMs for malicious activity? What can we do?
I have one. I'll let Selena go first. She got muted.
Oh no, go ahead, Tony.
For me, I like looking at the LOL RMM project because it has a lot of different resources in there. It has some Sigma rules and also has some signature things. So if you have Windows Defender application control, if you have other sort of signature, like digital signature or other file name hash-based controls like that in your environment, you can absolutely take details from RMMs that you're concerned about out of that project, feed those into your tools and do an allow listing, block listing sort of approach.
Mm-hmm. Also, too, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing, especially with some of the free versions, is cloud hosted versus on-prem hosted installations of a lot of these things. So if you, I think it's been mentioned a few times, but allow listing, right? So if you're working with your supplier, the organization, or whoever, they're going to likely have this sort of on-prem host, the known domains, known good. If you are sort of blocking on newly registered domains or more sort of cloud hosted RMMs that are, short-lived, likely using some of the free services. I also think it's interesting to note too how sometimes they will investigate. Some of these threat actors will kind of like do some open source research and see like, okay, what are you actually running within your environment? So trying to kind of hide it a little bit better to try and blend in just with the traffic itself. Certainly with Red Canary, Proofpoint also has network detections too. So we're constantly writing detection rules for some of these sort of known bad, recently seen network detections for a lot of these that look legitimate, could potentially blend in with traffic, have been a little bit clever, but are known bad. So making sure that you are keeping those detections up to date as well to see and flag on any malicious network traffic.
That is awesome. Sweet. All right. Do we want to go into file stuff next?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Talk about file
Let,
types.
let's
So
jump into files.
one of the reasons we wanted to mention this is in previous years, sometimes there'll be a particular kind of file type that gets really picked up and run with by adversaries. You know, there was a brief period where Qbot affiliates were using OneNote as mark of the web, and macros were starting to kind of become harder for adversaries to leverage. For us, for this year, we saw just a lot of different kinds of file types. We didn't see a specific trend or leaning in one direction towards one file type or another. Although I will say we have seen so many scripts. We've already talked about some scripts. ClickFix and Paste and Run uses scripts for execution. And so I think that if we had any particular theme, it would be script use by adversaries continues to be super high. Three of the threats in our top 10 for our threat detection report used scripts as part of their initial or early execution behavior chain. So we like to talk about this mitigation strategy a lot. If you can set a GPO to open scripts in Notepad, especially the kinds of scripts that not all of your users might necessarily need to open, then it just opens in a harmless text file and it sort of stops that execution chain really, really early on, which is nice, which is ideal.
Are you guys also seeing the sort of chaining nested PowerShell scripts? Like this script opens another PowerShell script, opens another
Yes.
PowerShell script. Yeah.
Yes, or goes on to open like bat scripts, or the chain scripts are definitely a thing that we have seen. Really complex execution chains.
It's just like turtles all the way down. Yeah, it's just so
Bad
many
turtles,
scripts.
evil turtles.
Yeah.
And then another one I want to kind of shout out is that we've also seen a lot of DLL and low bin low loss abuse in the past year. Sideloading has already come up in this presentation already. We've seen increased use of that. Again, I think because it's allows adversaries to bypass a lot of defender abilities. We have sometimes less visibility, especially from the endpoint perspective, into things that are maybe sideloaded and executed in process memory, for example, or injected into a different process. So that's been, I think, increasingly used. It's a more complex technique, but it has been paying dividends as defenders have gotten better at detecting kind of file type misuse.
And one thing I want to bring up too, I know there was one question from somebody about antivirus and anti-malware controls picking up things like RMM tools and ClickFix infections. Sideloading is one of those places where some of the endpoint like anti-malware stuff really does shine really well to help us out, because it's really hard to write those detection analytics for sideloading. There are so many potential sideload combinations in the world that are undocumented, like unreported on, undocumented, that like you almost have to kind of rely on some of those alerts and some of those antivirus, anti-malware definitions to save your bacon at times.
And as somebody just pointed out in the chat, yeah, this is yet again what's old is new again, where it just keeps coming around.
Absolutely. Awesome. So we talked a little bit about RMM, talked a little bit about some of the malicious files we see in the wild. Wanted to also kind of talk a little bit about identity things, because at the end of the day, even if an adversary is gaining initial access on something, they have to have an identity for them to log in with. So we can kind of jump into that.
Because I know that at Red Canary and also across the industry, one of the most common sources of initial access was legitimate credentials for this past year for VPNs. And that is, I think, due to some of these identity compromises. And we're going to have a quick side note for Steelers here in just a second. But if they're able to get valid credentials, and then sell them or leverage them themselves, that is a lot easier for them than trying to create initial access opportunities on the same number of systems that they could potentially steal credentials for. And so it's I think another thing that's becoming increasingly popular, if they're able to get access to cookies, browser cookies, and get session data, if they're able to kind of this identity compromise space also is something that's becoming more of a factor as people move to the cloud. If they're able to get cloud access and get access to cloud resources, that's a really appealing target for a lot of adversaries.
Absolutely. And I love talking about the cloud side because it really covers something for us of like, yeah, there is something about a lot of compromises occur on the endpoint. However, like there are so many like cloud accessible tools nowadays. Like for example, if an organization uses a endpoint management tool that is cloud-based, all it requires is having credentials on the wrong console and someone can get in and manage systems.
Well, that's a good
Awesome.
point too about like RMMs and targeting RMMs, because like in addition to sending them as basically using it as a loader, also targeting the credentials for RMM tools within an environment, because it does give you, broad access. And so phishing for those credentials as well, I think is very interesting. And we've seen, certainly ransomware threat actors using some of that activity as well.
Mhm.
It's awesome. So going on to the next slide here.
This is our quick note on Stealers. We know this is getting past initial access and getting into kind of post-access execution and exploitation activity. But it's driving a lot of the valid credential abuse that we've seen in the past year and that other folks have seen as well. So um, exciting to say that number one for 2024, Lumacy 2, I know that we actually have not seen it at Red Canary since the takedown. So that's exciting. I know that it has been seen by other folks, but it seems to have been, in our case, it seems to have been pretty successful. So again, shout out Operation In-Game. That's super awesome.
And I was excited seeing the Luma stuff because like a lot of the magic behind like, yeah, Luma is a stealer, but a lot of the magic behind Luma and some of its platform was where adversaries could like share credentials really easily and publish them to marketplaces really easily and things like that. So it's heartwarming to see that sort of platform taken down to make it a little bit harder for people to keep their operations going.
I think it's great. And I also kind of wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to info stealers that are like how it's being used, because recently, I believe it was just this week, Microsoft as well as the Netherlands General Intelligence and Security Service, so it's the Dutch intelligence, published about a Russia affiliated threat actor targeting critical infrastructures. And what really stood out to me, which I was very delighted about, is the threat actor uses stolen credentials, which are likely procured from commodity info stealer ecosystems, and collects a high volume of emails and files from compromised organizations. So, it's not just the cyber criminal threat actors that are using these commodity stealers and the data that is procured from them, but we see some of this overlap with the espionage ecosystem too, going to that well of information that is available once these are executed within an environment, is fueling a lot of different overall objectives within the threat landscape.
Awesome. All right. So talk a little bit about Steelers. No, one of the last topics I wanted to talk about was a little bit of something for macOS systems because enterprises are diverse nowadays. Like there's not just Windows, there's everything else in the world. Um, so wanted to include a little bit of something for the macOS folks among all of us, especially since Steelers were really prevalent on macOS systems for the last year. Um, what we ended up seeing a lot last year was the Steelers like Atomic and Poseidon Stealer would have malicious DMG files that people would go and download. So these may be through malvertising. They may have found them as like, they're searching for cracked versions of software they don't want to pay the extra money for. So they try to find a cracked version and then find a malicious DMG that has Poseidon Stealer on it. When you open up that DMG, there would be something like you would see on the screen here, like an image where it would try to coach you through doing a right click and open, because that was how you could bypass gatekeeper controls in macOS. A lot of the gatekeeper controls are those controls to kind of limit you to signed executables in macOS. Really awesome thing about this is Apple saw this, Apple took action and said, not in our house. And somewhere around October to November of last year, they released macOS Sequoia, which mixed some things up. They took away that right click open for executables like that, You can still do that with like right click and execute on shell scripts, things like that. So there's still a little bit of coaching that happens like that. But something that has also been happening in the wild nowadays, when you start getting some of those stealers again, is what you see on the left-hand side of the screen, where you would get a malicious DMG, but instead of being coached into right click and running to bypass Gatekeeper, instead they coach people into running a shell script to bypass Gatekeeper. And so inside that DMG, there would be a shortcut to the macOS terminal, and they would just coach you through drag and drop this shell script over on the terminal. A bunch of commands start running in the background, and then that goes and launches your stealer. Good news is the stealers behave the same as the stealers did last year. They have the same commands, they have all that different stuff in them. Catch is just the initial access is a little bit different. Instead of, you know, executing immediately from that /volumes folder where it gets mounted as a DMG, it would get copied somewhere else and then run. You'd see a little bit more activity. Something that's been a little bit more harrowing to see for me in the last couple of months has been paste and run things starting to, paste and run and ClickFix things starting to affect macOS systems. Because we kind of saw a little bit of this in the past. Doing the whole curl to bash or all of that stuff all in one command has been really common on macOS and Linux and Unix systems over the years. I always kind of joke with people, friends don't let friends curl to bash, but that's really how a lot of software gets deployed on those platforms. We've seen in the past like fake homebrew websites, fake software websites where someone would pull down a stealer that's imitating as homebrew or something else. Now we're starting to see like actual these ClickFix fake captcha lures or fake Cloudflare lures, things like that, that have been seen on the Windows side, but they're just now being translated to Mac. And you can kind of see on the screen there, like the coaching really is a little bit more laborious compared to Windows. Like you could see like instead of just the Windows R and paste, they have to talk through a bunch of additional steps that go into it.
So Tony, I'm curious from your perspective, do you think that that is less effective because it's so laborious?
I don't think so,
Hmm.
because macOS users and Linux users have been used to deploying software and doing things like this for long enough
Well,
that,
but for like an average user though, are they,
well, right.
do they do this? Like, I feel like
The
most people who use Macs don't even know what the terminal is, Like,
Well, right. And I think it is effective for power users. The average user, I'm not sure. That's the hard part. But unfortunately, there are a lot of power users with Macs in the enterprise,
yeah.
because like those power users are going to be using macOS for like developer work. They're going to be using them for systems engineering work, stuff like that. So I would be interested to know if how effective it would be for someone in like a generic business administration who doesn't do IT management. Do they have a Mac, and is this effective against them? That is a very awesome
Yeah,
question.
I'm curious.
I'd also like to know that there have been reports of a version of this for Linux as well, where
Yeah.
you requires user interaction to click a button that executes a shell command that kicks off shell script execution and pulls down a remote payload. So this is definitely still expanding in scope.
Adam's favorite topic, Linux.
Well, and this is all going to be really fun if you're going to try to look at like this command line, for example. So you're talking about it being close to what people are already doing, but this is character for character, the command line that is on the home page for doing curl to bash. Like it's the exact same flags to curl in the same order, in the same symbols. And so this is a command line other than that URL that you're going to find on any network with power users.
It works. And thank you for mentioning the Linux part, because mentally I'm thinking like if you're one of the tens like me who are living for the year of the Linux desktop coming sometime soon, like you're still not going to be safe from some of the ClickFix stuff. There's still some thought process into the internet. Um, awesome stuff. So no, we're pretty close to time. So wanted to close out with a couple of things. Wanted to close out with some predictions and things to plug. So we didn't actually have a plan on the prediction stuff. So this part is 100% seat of the pants live, folks. So this is where it gets fun. All right, who wants to go first?
I'll go first.
That works.
All right, so Steph's hot take is that social engineering is proving to be so effective that adversaries, even folks that aren't big players in the scene, are going to lean into that even more. So we're going to go back to even more frequent, tailored, bespoke phishing attempts, phone calls. I think that's just going to increase because it's so challenging to defend against, because defenders have gotten really good at defending against the things that happen via processes that people don't have a whole lot of input into. So I think that they're going to start leaning on the human factor more and more and more.
So I think in that, but to that point though, I think there's maybe a little bit of overhype on AI in offensive activity. But I think this is one area where large language models may be coming even more into play. It's already happening where people are crafting better lures using their, GPT and other large language models. But I think we're going to see lures get better and better, much faster, much better language, even past where we are now. Just a prediction for a technique from old is new again, maybe trusted relationship. I don't think we've seen enough of that lately. Taking advantage of people outsourcing management, moving into cloud services. And so I'll probably be wrong, but that's my prediction.
Oh no, that is ripe to go after with the RMM world. That's devious.
Yes, these are all good. So first of all though, I would like to push back a little bit on the AI creation of emails. Do you guys know that meme that's like, I ain't reading all that, like happy for you, or sorry that happened? Like, that's how I feel every time I see an AI generated email. I'm like, I ain't reading all that, like, sorry it happened, congrats though. Like, and what we do actually see, so I see, obviously, I live in email land. Human beings are terrible at writing emails. Like, so, if like there's a lot of legitimate email traffic that are poorly written and have bad grammar and bad spelling. And so I don't necessarily know. I'm curious to see data on the impact of LLM generated emails versus not LLM generated emails. Only because, humans are just, typo machines ourselves, myself included. So I'm very curious, and I will literally, if I see something that's AI generated, I'm like, okay, I'm not reading this email. Like, it's so long. It's laborious, please. But to the social engineering thing, I think I agree. Also, on the AI piece, though, I would say the threat actors are probably going to run out of options for exploiting AI stuff and LLM tools before defenders do, just because the cost of development is not something that they can easily get their hands on. But certainly that will probably decrease as, there's more of open source available tools. But I do think that we'll see a lot more innovation from the defender side with some of this stuff than we see from the threat actor side for some of this stuff. But my big main prediction is we are due for like an absolutely outrageous O-Day. Like, we
Don't do that.
had one. I
Put
feel
that
like,
evil on me, Ricky Bobby.
yeah.
She just whispered, it's too quiet today.
I'm so sorry, but like a perimeter, maybe like some sort of perimeter O-Day out there is lurking. I'm sorry, I just had to drop a bomb on this, but I'm like, okay, where is it? What's happening?
All right. Well, with all of that said, we have some pluggables.
Before we move on to pluggables,
yes.
I actually have a question.
Yes.
Because we have a really good question that sort of ties into Adam's prediction about trusted relationships. So do we have any recommendations for folks? This is a great question from Kieran. For folks where initial access comes in from a third party, from another vendor, maybe a smaller org that doesn't have as robust of a security posture, what tips would we have for dealing with or kind of thinking about that type of initial access when you can't block communication from, say, a compromised supplier?
For one, bet your suppliers. It's a really soft answer compared to click a box, stop it from coming in. But yeah, at least having an idea of the security of your vendors and the space that they're in, and a risk assessment of sort of what you're connecting in, more segmentation if you can, have some boundaries in there. Don't just have a nice, soft, chewy line from your vendor out there that you don't have insight into their security, into your own space. Yeah.
That works.
I
So-
do think, oh, go ahead.
Wow, Selena first.
I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting how there are some things, for example, like cybersecurity insurance, that are incorporating requirements for third-party vendors, supplier security audits. And so really leveraging that within an organization and saying, okay, like what are my requirements for my organization, but as well as, for example, cybersecurity insurance requirements, to align those with the supply chain risk, I think is super helpful to especially to get the buy-in from your executives to say, okay, we actually do have to invest in this and do these audits because it aligns with our business and risk analysis that we're paying like for cyber insurance. So I think that's an interesting tie in there.
That's awesome. Yeah, one thing that I used to, so I come from like systems admin background way back when, and like in a previous life, what we would do for vendors was, if we knew we were going to be working with vendor A today, vendor A had their own account, and that account was locked up until like half an hour before they were expected to log into stuff. We would unlock that account, then when they're done for the day, go and lock that account back. If they had, specific RMM software that they needed for, um, for their particular stuff, we only had that RMM on that one system that they needed. And, if as soon as we got rid of that relationship with that vendor, that RMM came off, stuff like that. Awesome. So cover a couple of pluggables in here. So we like to be able to lead people into other resources to help them in their organization. So a couple of things, ATT&CK. We've got that coming up soon, and Adam, I know would feel strongly about getting more people submitting CFPs to ATT&CK, especially Linux and Mac. Coming up every Tuesday, Red Canary has office hours. I think Miss Stef is jumping into some of that soon.
I get to go on once a month and talk about our Intel Insights previews. So yeah, every Tuesday at 1 o'clock, they have these office hours, Keith and Dave. It's a good time. So definitely go check that out if you're curious about hearing more Red Canary perspectives, hearing from some more of our canaries.
And if seeing Canary content virtually is simply not enough, you must go out to your local community and find it. We're showing up at a couple of, or at a few different conferences. So Jerry, who does some of our readiness stuff, is showing up at SANS Virtual Ransomware Summit. I say it in person, that's virtual, go figure. As well as Christina at RVA-SEC and Brian Donahue at Gartner Security and Risk Summit. So absolutely look for the people in the Redbird shirts and come say hi. We're always happy to talk to people.
The comfiest shirts, the comfiest.
Yeah, exactly. I'm holding on to this. So we've got a couple of minutes for a couple of last questions, I think. So one question I did want to cover in here. So something we previously mentioned was talking about changing default file handlers for some file types to Notepad. And one person in chat in Q&A said, we suggested doing this with our IT team, but for various reasons, IT team said we couldn't do this. And are there kind of workarounds, any other things? One of the things I like telling people is like, group policy objects are essentially kind of fancy registry settings. Anything that you do with group policies, you can also do with registry settings and scripts and stuff like that. So even if you can't necessarily deploy it with a group policy object, maybe you can import registry keys on a schedule, like do a scheduled task with a script or something like that, and have those pop up every so often instead of doing your group policy object. Anything that you could do with the GPO, you can probably do with registry keys. All right. Is there anything else that folks wanted to cover from the questions?
Nothing for me.
Awesome. Well, with all that said, thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you to the entire panel for sharing your time with us and expertise today. And for everybody that's here, if you want to come back and watch this in the future, keep an eye out on your email. You should be seeing a link to this recording soon, and you can peruse to your heart's content.
This was so much
Thanks,
fun.
everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Good
Thank
times.
you.